So, in this part of our lecture, we are going to try and understand quite a few very important aspects that we discussed in the beginning of the course, and right now, maybe you are in a better position to have some clarity on them. First of all, we must discuss on the contextualizing issue. So, when we say that we are contextualizing folk art, it raises a lot of different questions into its connecting understandings. First of all, we question that what is the relevance of this practice in today's context, and that is a very big question. You ask anybody, even a person who is not who is hardly aware of the practice, its growth, and its present condition. They're just familiar with some bit of an image, or maybe not. It's like there are people who would just connect folk art as they have heard about folk songs, etc. So they connect certain rural practice which are connected to the rural rituals. And that way they may frame a picture, and even after then they'll question the relevance of this practice in today's cultural margin. So from this point, it's very important to get a deeper look and try to unfold the entire discussion in a contextualized direction. So there, the first thing that we must look at is what is the context that we are facing today, what is the relevance of folk art in that context. The practice, as we said, that it started with many different notions. To review it once more, the primary notions were to provide common mass with an alternative education, which is more like those who are not literate in a formal sense. For them, it was an alternative literacy. Through visuals, they were getting connected to the age-old sagas, the epics, the moral stories, which are very important. So it was discussed many a times that though people were illiterate, they were not uneducated because of the practice of folk art and folk culture. So it's somehow we are taking a cultural perspective when we look into it for that reason, and also it goes to a social direction, and that involves the socio-political condition, the economic factors, and many other things into it, because it's finally related to a visual culture and also a literary culture that is connected to it. So there are like other important aspects that we discussed earlier, and I would also like to mention that in this context that one very important role or purpose of folk art had been to educate common people and give them a moral lesson. So that way they worked as a social proliferation of different knowledges. Sometimes in different contexts we try to contextualize that in today's term. For example, when some awareness is needed in the rural India on the vaccination, for example, or female foeticide, there are many other issues like dowry system and many other things that needs to be spreaded out. Many of the time the social reformers, the socialists, the activists, and also from some other government organization and non-government organizations, they seek help of the existing Patachitra painters in different places. They're the folk painters, and they were actually asked to paint images to build up awareness. Sometimes it also has happened the folk painters themselves they got proactive and came up with imageries that had all this current events painted in it. So the role is continued, but not as the only means, but there are many other alternatives. If we think that the main role of folk art is to proliferate or propagate certain awareness, certain issues to common people, then perhaps the other mediums, TV, internet, radio, they have better outreach. Because all these people now they're exposed to all sort of cross media activities. So in that context we can always say that the existing the traditional purpose of folk art is lost to a great extent, but it's leaving for a very different purpose, and that is perhaps more glorified and more important. It is the stylistic identity of folk art that gave us our own indigenous style, and the style of execution, which is very, very indigenous for any folk practice that was there. It was needed for the context of the pre-colonial and post-colonial India that we have been discussing. We'll continue our discussion in the same direction just to understand what happened to our country and to the visual culture of our country during this post-colonial and also the pre-colonial India. It's just before independence and after independence, and it's very important to look at any visual culture regardless of folk, urban or anything else. In fact, the mainstream academic things in that perspective to understand what is needed, what is the need of today's time, and that perhaps will also justify the need to study this topic, this kind of a subject in today's time, as we know that not many of us are basically studying and researching on Indian folk and minor art. So this is again to justify the contextual importance of it. So we are continuing from our last discussion of the academic and folk art tradition that was going parallelly during the pre and post colonial era, and then we also discussed the phenomenon of Nandalal Bose, Jamini Rai and other people who became very, very instrumental to understand the folk idioms, to understand the folk ethos, and that is perhaps most important for us to realize now, that how the basic ethics, the basic value system that was there in folk art and minor art tradition in our India, that is still on, and there are lots of things to be taken from there. So I'll begin this particular part of the module with a quotation from Pranabranjan Rai, where he was commenting on Kalighat painting, that is urban tradition, and as we know that that was something which was not like the rural Patachitra tradition of India, though it's a urban and rural, both are Patachitra traditions, but there had been a lot of difference between the two. Not so much in terms of the stylistic identity. Of course, there are quite a few very distinctive stylistic identity that make it very separate. It's not very difficult to separate them and identify them very distinctively. But this is also a fact that the tradition was there, like the Kalighat Pat painting, which is the urban tradition, that was more to cater to the common people. It went to an extent where they only supplied according to the public taste. That has never happened with the other rural Patachitra tradition that we had in the districts of Bengal. And also when we move to the southern India or the northern part, the western India, we saw that they are working for certain purposes. But storytelling had been always emphasized and they responded to a very a very conscious term. It's not very generalized, unlike Kalighat Patachitra painting. Of course, like Kalighat Patachitra painting was much more sophisticated, but it got under the influence of mass production after a while, and that was perhaps the basic reason of its decline also. So in that way, let me just read certain thoughts of from the by with the help of one quotation from Pranab Ranjan Rai in this context. So our topic is contextualizing folk idiom, and I am going to read Pranab Ranjan Rai's comment on this. Kalighat Pat tradition, howsoever it may have differed from the traditional Pat painting of rural Bengal, did not lead to the emergence of the self-conscious individual artist with personal thematic and stylistic concerns. The thematic and visual linguistic concern of Kalighat Patuas till the end remained under community hegemony, so much so that the Patuas would endlessly go on producing similar images in similar style. The Kalighat tradition of Pat painting can at best be assigned its place in the history of Indian art as comprising a school of proto-history of modern Indian art. The postmodern visual linguistics of Kalighat Pat impressed the modern Bengal individualist artists like the post-1925 Jamini Roy, Sunandani Devi, in the 30s and 40s Nandalal Bose of Haripura Congress posters, Abanindranath of his Chandimangal and Krishnamangal series, Nirod Majumdar and Paritosh Sen, so much that they appropriated and adapted elements from the Kalighat Pat tradition and saved their art from being derivative of Eurogenetic modernist art and or revivalist Indian art. So contextualizing folk idioms to express the spirit of nationalism in context of Haripura posters. Nandalal Bose, a versatile artist, art educationist and nationalist, fostered the idea of creativity that is limitless and free, and at the same time duty bound to its history and cultural heritage. He experimented his ideology all his life through his art practice. He endorsed the worth of urban and rural folk art that was perishing to the threat of foreign aesthetics. Nandalal Bose's conviction in favor of folk aesthetics to work as a tool for shaping up indigenous art nurtured his own creative endeavors all his life that resulted in numerous significant individual and community projects that he took up with his students and co-artists. So I'll quote from K.G. Subramaniam in this context. Even after he, a renowned artist and educator, he continued to see art and artisan practice as a connected panorama that ensured aesthetics creativity in a modern environment. So it was 1935 that Nandalal Bose took up the project to install an art show at Lucknow session of Congress requested by Mahatma Gandhi. As a part of the nation building endeavors of that time. It was a collective work accomplished and assisted by Binod Bihari Mukherjee, Vinayak Rao Masoji, Prabhat Mohan Bandhopadhyay and Asit Haldar, all the Bengal school disciples of Nandalal Bose. Then in February 1938 at Haripura Congress, Bardoli, Gujarat, Nandalal Bose set an exemplary demonstration of environmental art project using local materials and the local artistry. The environment was duly complemented by these paintings depicting Indian daily life scenes, much famed as Haripura posters. it's very interesting to see how he incorporated the secular subject matters into his artwork, and also he adapted the style of the rural and urban folk paintings of that time. So, and that was also very context relevant, because he painted the posters to create impact to the mass and connecting the local people at work. It had a realist approach to it, and that made it much more appealing to the mass. So it was very context specific, at the same time universal. So this is one aspect where we see that one artist who is he was a teacher by profession in an art school. Although that art school was also like Kala Bhavan, that was inspired by the nationalistic ideologies, and Nandalal Bose is known to be the one of the pioneers in the nationalist movement. But this is also very interesting to see that a person who is trained in the academic style in art is taking up all these projects and realizing the importance of the folk idioms, the folk ethos, the folk understanding, and making certain artworks which are exemplary. The works, it followed the process close to the community folk art, where everybody works in the same process. In fact, that was one reason, because he was not working individually. He was masterminding the project. Of course, he did most of them, but he made his students, the fellow colleagues, to work with him in a team. And I took their name. Asoji was there, Asit Haldar was there, and many more people were there. And all of them, they quickly learned the process because it was part of their regular training, and they participated in the project. Many of them painted, like, it was more like the linear parts were done by somebody, then the other one put up the color, and that way they put up all those posters. So it actually followed a process that was very close to the community practice of the folk art practice of our country, where the master painter leads the team, and the production team, they work for it. Nandalal painted nearly 80 posters by himself in an approximate size of 2 feet by 2 feet. Those are mostly squarish frames with some arches on top. And his associate teammates made close copies of those paintings to multiply the number, which is close to 400. Nandalal Bose admitted that he had chosen the putter style of painting for Haripura posters. It's written and documented. The text is Vision and Creation, that is published by Vishwabharati in 1999, where Nandalal Bose's articles are there, and he has stated it very clearly. The paintings were made in confined frames to maintain symmetrical order with the purpose of public display. The paintings were made at the outer periphery of the pavilion with the prior envision of effective public viewing as the prime concern of these paintings. The strategic use of locally available art colors ensured vibrancy to the scheme. Nandalal Bose used bold and strong, long brush strokes to minimize the intricacy in order to make them more obvious and expressive. The paintings has certain monumental quality to it, that if the size is reduced or even increased, the impact was not lost ever. The lines and colors were bold, brilliant and energetic, with simple graphic flatness that provided the painting with a fresh and smart appearance. The figurative compositions were apparently decorative and semi-abstract, but There was a distinct dynamism in each composition that dragged the posters to a greater depth. The obvious contours were needed for distant viewing, so brush strokes were large, continuous, and well rendered, as well as the use of color was patchy, calculative, with an intention to create maximum effect through minimum application, typical of mural art projects. The characters performing various activities like playing musical instruments, hunting, controlling cattle, carpenters and blacksmiths at work, women cooking, and their derivatives of experiential realism. The compositions were rhythmic with dynamic forms to emanate a cheerful energy. The expression overpowered decorativeness reminiscent of the spontaneous spirit of Kalighat Pat and other forms of folk paintings, which is mentioned by Parthometer in 2007. Nandalal Bose recorded for posterity the likeness of the last Kalighat painter Nibaran Ghosh. Abanindranath Tagore wrote a booklet on Bengali women's ritual art in 1919, sought to capture the rugged quality of Bengali folk art in his paintings based on the religious texts named Kabikankan Chandi and Krishna Mangal. Devi Prasad Roy Chaudhary met Abanindranath with a view to get trained under his guidance. The master advised the young artist to study Kalighat Patachitra. Stella Cambridge drew the attention of the European avant-garde to the bold simplification of Kalighat painting in 1925. The following year, Ajit Ghosh's influential article altered the reading public to the importance of this folk art, comparing its formal boldness to that of Cubism. Seen in the picture are two images from Kalighat painting, the rural folk tradition of Eastern India. The subject matters had a religious and secular base. So, this is very evident, and when you make more studies into the Haripura poster or Kalighat painting tradition, understanding the stylistic affinity there. In fact, when we look at the volumes created in Kalighat painting extensively, also the kind of space that was part of Kalighat painting, we feel that there is not only Cubism but some bit of a Fauvism and the Western influence was there. Though this is evident that these people were not directly connected to all these movements that took place in Europe. They had the knowledge of it because many of the painters, they were familiar with the current academic trend. And the study may go on and on in this direction, but right now we'll have to come back and stick to the context and move to our next lecture.